The cold wind swept across the barren valley, carrying with it the distant echoes of approaching danger. A lone figure crouched behind a weary fallen log. Apache warrior's keen eyes scanning the horizon, muscles tense beneath the worn leather of his gear. Behind him, a woman's breath hitched in the dimming light. The widow, her arms wrapped protectively around 3 fragile infants, their soft cries barely audible above the harsh silence. The quiet before the storm was breaking, and the fury that would soon descend on this forgotten land was already beginning to stir. The sun dipped low beyond the jagged peaks, casting long shadows over the isolated ranch nestled at the edge of the dry prairie. Dust clung to twisted fence posts, and the air hung heavy with the scent of scorched grass and wood smoke. The landscape was a harsh, unforgiving place, a world where survival demanded both courage and quiet resilience. Here, the widow's homestead stood as a fragile sanctuary, vulnerable to the unforgiving hands of fate and men alike. Inside the dim cabin, her tired eyes traced the wavering candlelight dancing across the rough-hewn walls. The triplets, downy-headed and innocent, nestled against her in a bundle of warmth and breathless hope. Her hands trembled as they eased each child closer to her heart, burdened by loss and a fierce determination to protect what little remained of her world. The echoes of war still shadowed her, but now another presence knitted into their fragile existence, a stranger with eyes like storm clouds and a spirit tempered by unspoken grief. The Apache warrior who had crossed into her life amid gunfire and desperation. He bore the weight of exile and allegiance to a tribe whose wrath was as fierce as the desert sun. Yet in these stolen moments, he was no mere warrior. He was a guardian, bound by a desperate choice, shielding the vulnerable from encroaching death. His hands, calloused and steady, concealed the tenderness underneath the warrior's fierce exterior. Together, they faced an uncertain horizon where foe and friend blurred, and the line between salvation and doom thinned like ragged twilight. The threat was nearer than either dared speak aloud. A relentless, patrolling force closing in, hell-bent on extinguishing any trace of defiance left in these borderlands. Yet the warrior had sworn an oath, a silent vow to protect the widow and her triplets, come what may. In that shared silence, trust was fragile and raw, yet indispensable. The widow's gaze met his, a complex mix of fear and defiance, while the infant stirred, oblivious to the gathering storm. Moments slipped into an uneasy stillness as the first stars blinked awake overhead. The warrior's voice broke the quiet, low and steady. They come for us. If I leave, they bring death. If I stay, they bring fire to this place. His words hung like a weight in the air. She nodded, gripping the tiny hands of her children, the flicker of hope mingling with dread. Yet beneath the surface, the apron strings of fear fought the fierce shadow of survival. Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the night. The triplets startled awake, frightened by the distant howl of desperate hounds. The warrior's eyes darted toward the ridge, where the glint of riders' spurs caught the moonlight, a relentless patrol closing in fast. The widow's breath hitched, but she stood taller now, steeling herself against the tide. This was no longer merely a haven. It was the epicenter of a coming storm that would awaken the tribe's fierce wrath, a conflict woven of blood, honor, and survival. Before the valley could fall silent once more, the warrior drew his bow, the taut string humming with deadly promise. Many trailblazers who follow the stories woven through these lands have whispered of sudden disappearances from our fold, whether by fate or the cunning hand of the frontier's shifting paths. Before the next chapter of this perilous journey unfolds, pause for a moment and check below this tale. Make sure your place in our band remains unbroken. We would not want the thread of this story to slip beyond your reach. Confirm your membership now. Join us and stand ready when the next reckoning comes. The night had settled fully over the valley, thick and unyielding like a heavy cloak. The widow's cabin, fragile and worn, seemed more a heartbeat than a home, a desperate refuge where the weighted breaths of her triplets mingled with the sharp scent of fear. Outside, the world was closing in. The patrol was no longer a distant threat, but an urgent reality, moving like a storm on the wind, relentless and unrepentant. The Apache warrior crouched tighter against the cold earth, bow gripped steady, eyes tracing the ridge where the faint clatter of hooves and the metallic whisper of spurs cut through the darkness. His breaths came slow and measured, a quiet rhythm of survival. But beneath the calm lay a roiling tempest. There was no room for error. Not now, not when the lives nestled behind that weathered door depended on his every move. Inside, the widow pressed her back to the rough wall, cradle tightening around her children, as though sheer willpower might shield them from what lurked beyond. Every cry of the frightened infants twisted the knife deeper into her resolve. The past clung to her like a shadow. The husbands lost to endless wars. The promises shattered beneath an unforgiving sun. Tonight, the only fight left was for the fragile thread of hope she still dared to hold. A rustle to the west broke the tenuous silence, a sudden snapping of twig, faint but fatal in this suspended moment. The warrior's gaze snapped back, narrowing. Not a scout, something closer. A flicker of movement, a silhouette darting through gnarled sagebrush, and the sharp gleam of a knife reflected moonlight. His muscles tensed, instincts flaring like a firestorm. No longer just a protector, he was a hunter now, eyes blazing with a feral intensity born from decades of exile and survival. He moved silently, a shadow among shadows, weaving through the brush toward the source. The wind carried a faint, desperate whisper, a woman's voice, broken and haggard. The warrior's heart clenched. More souls tangled in this nightmare. Suddenly, a shot screamed across the dark, a bullet tearing through the air, and something shattered behind him. A heavy thud that shook the earth beneath. The warrior ducked instinctively, trembling not from fear, but rage. A burning fury that scorched, cold and sharp. They were here, back at the cabin. The widow's breath caught as the echo of gunfire shattered the fragile peace. She clutched the triplets fiercely, rocking them with trembling arms. her gaze flickering to the cracks in the cabin's timber, as if the walls themselves might bleed. The night seemed to pulse with menace, each heartbeat a drumbeat closer to destruction. Words unspoken stretched between her and the warrior's heavy footsteps, returning to the threshold. The air between them was thick with shared dread, yet neither faltered. Eyes met, hers wide with desperate hope. His steely with grim resolve. There was no room for doubt now. The wolves had found their scent. 3 riders, the warrior said, in a voice roughened by dry earth and deeper wounds. Scouts, they will not stop until their master arrives. This is more than a hunt. It is a clearing of ghosts. Ghosts or vengeance? Her voice cracked, a fragile thread in the suffocating dark. Why us? Why this place? She rocked the babies closer, each heartbeat a fragile prayer. He glanced toward the dim horizon where moonlight scattered over distant hills. This land carries stories written in blood. They want to erase every one of them. Despite the cold, a flicker of heat warmed her chest, a stubborn ember of defiance. Then we'll write new ones, she breathed, voice steadying. Together. A low growl returned from beyond the timber. A warning or a curse. It was impossible to tell. The cabin walls shivered. Outside, the sounds of hooves grew louder, closer, closing the noose tight around. Their sanctuary. The warrior moved to stack what little provisions remained. A battered rifle, a handful of arrows, a coil of slack rope. His hands trembled slightly, betraying the storm inside. In these moments, the warrior was not legend or ghost of the plains. He was merely a man, caught between survival and sacrifice. A sudden cry pierced the night, the widow's soft gasp as the cabin door quivered under the first persistent blows. The furious pounding shattered the night's fragile veil. The patrol had arrived. The warrior grabbed the door, bracing his weight as wood splintered and splintered again, like malice made physical. The triplets cried out, a chorus of vulnerability in the raging tempest of approaching violence. His eyes blazed as the lock gave way, the darkness spilling over like a flood. Hands rough and sure sought entry. Armed men shadowed by hate and the cold discipline of an unyielding command. With a fierce, guttural shout, the warrior loosed an arrow, streaking through the stale air, thudding deep into the first assailant's leather. A ragged cry of pain joined the howling wind. It was not over. The widow, shivering but unbroken, screamed into the dark, calling on every trace of strength she had. The triplets huddled tighter, their small faces shining with tears and golden light from the flickering hearth, the last fragile beacon against the gathering storm. Then, amidst the chaos, a chilling voice barked orders in cold, clipped tones. Find the Apache. Do not let him escape. The threat was clear. The stakes beyond survival had shifted. This was now a hunt for blood and broken honor. Eyes locked in a fierce battle of wills, the warrior and widow understood their paths were intertwined, bound by blood and fire. Neither could step back, neither could yield. And beneath the shattered stars, a new shadow moved along the ridge. A figure cloaked in black, unknown, yet unmistakably familiar. The warrior's breath froze in his throat as recognition slammed into him like a thunderbolt. The hunter had come to finish what was begun long ago. The cabin door groaned under the relentless pounding, splinters cracking like fragile bones. The warrior's breath was steady despite the chaos. His arms braced like iron against the trembling wood. Each desperate cry of the triplets surged within him, a relentless drumbeat urging him to hold fast. Outside, the patrol's shadow stretched longer, weaving like a net drawn tighter with every furious hammer against the thin barrier between sanctuary and slaughter. A jagged arrow whispered through the stale air, sharp, unyielding, finding its mark amid the advancing figures. A ragged shout burst, full of pained surprise, as one man stumbled back, clutching a seeping wound. But there was no time for mercy. With a savage chorus of curses, the attackers surged forward again, battering the fragile wall until shattered wood splintered free, littering the rough floor like shards of broken hope. The warrior's eyes flicked to the widow as she clutched her children closer, a silent prayer etched deep in her hard-won gaze. The flicker of candlelight painted their faces in trembling gold, shadows casting long, trembling fingers along the cabin's walls. Her fingers tightened fiercely, a shield wrought from defiance and desperation. Behind those fragile eyes, a fierce storm raged, love's fierce fire battling the gathering dark. Suddenly, the cabin was breached. The first figure spilled through the torn threshold, boots scraping against the uneven floorboards. The warrior met him like a tempest, a fierce roar unraveling from deep within his chest as he swung the bow like a club. Wood cracked hard against leather and bone. The triplets wailed, an eerie symphony shaking the fragmented calm. From the door's jagged gap, cold glints flashed. The patrol was armed with relentless precision, every move honed in the deadly game of survival. They advanced as a tide of iron will, hearts iced over by orders and hardened by vengeance. The warrior ducked low, rolling away from the nearest strike, pain flashing hot across his ribs. Gritting his teeth, he surged upward, eyes wild during the brutal ballet unfolding in the cramped space. His hands found a fallen plank and swung with brutal force, knocking a man into howls of fury and rage. Yet the enemy came fast, and the shadow at the ridge watched, silent and waiting. Then a sudden choking laughter rattled the air, dark, cold as the grave. A voice, sharp and familiar, sliced through the tumult. "You think this will save you? You are but ghosts clinging to dust, soon to be swept away." The air thickened. His words carried the weight of hunted history and vengeful fury. The warrior's gaze froze, recognition striking with the force of thunder. The figure cloaked in black, standing just beyond the shattered doorway, radiated menace and sorrow. A hunter incarnate, come to finish a reckoning, decades in the making. His eyes, cold and unforgiving, locked onto the warrior with the weight of an unspoken charge. "No peace here," the hunter hissed, voice ablaze in the night air. "You betrayed us all." The widow gasped, heart caught in the tightening coil of dread and defiance. She whispered hoarsely, "Why now, after all this pain?" The hunter's shadow lengthened as he stepped forward, boots crunching over broken earth outside, vanishing only to reappear at the window's shattered glass. A silent specter weaving through their fragile refuge. "Because some debts cannot be buried," he answered, voice a promise of fire and blood. The warrior's jaw clenched, fury and anguish dancing in dark eyes. Every muscle screamed with the temptation to flee. Yet the oath held fast, an indomitable vow to shield the widow and her infants from this storm. "I will stand," he growled, voice raw, "even if the world falls with me." Outside, the hooves of the approaching patrol thundered nearer. Fragments of moonlight flashing against steel. The night pressurized, thick with the scent of gunpowder, fear, and loss. The valley seemed to hold its breath, a fragile pause before the inevitable tempest. A single tear traced the widow's cheek as she lifted trembling hands toward the broken sky, whispering prayers without words. Her voice broke the silence. "Then let us meet the dawn on our own terms." In the shadowed depths of the cabin, something shifted. A quiet surrender to the coming storm, wrapped in defiance. Fragile lives, now bound with the fierce breath of destiny. And beyond the ridge, the hunter smiled, a cold and terrible promise glowing in his gaze. Tonight, the past would bleed into the present. Tomorrow, only ashes would answer. But on. This breath held tight in the darkness. The warrior's voice rose, just a whisper in the night. "This is far from over." A rattling cough erupted from beyond the doorway, sudden and jagged. From the darkness emerged a new figure, one neither the widow nor the warrior recognized. Eyes sharp with secrets and unread histories, cloaked not in black, but in the fading light of a dying star. Before either could react, a star-flaring shot shattered the tense air, and the unknown figure doubled. Silence froze the cabin as a single word slipped through the dust. Betrayal. The cabin door splintered under relentless force, shards of wood scattering like broken hopes across the creaking floor. The warrior's breath was steady, muscles locked. In iron resolve, as the cries of the triplets surged around him, a haunting chorus woven with innocence and terror. Outside, the patrol's shadows lengthened, a tightening noose drawn by cold hands, fueled by orders and unyielding wrath. An arrow sliced the stagnant air, swift and unforgiving, piercing the first man who dared breach their fragile sanctuary. His startled shout was swallowed by the wind, but there was no mercy here. The attackers surged forward, a tide of bitter vengeance, limbs and weapons colliding in a brutal dance of desperation. The cabin trembled as splinters rained down, echoing the fractured peace of this dark night. The warrior's eyes locked onto the widow's trembling form. She clutched her infants with fierce tenderness, eyes wide pools of courage caught in a storm of fear. Flickering candlelight cast wavering shadows upon the walls, their fingers reaching like desperate hands, clinging to a thinning veil of safety. Her heart beat like a wild drum, a relentless rhythm of love and defiance that refused to be silenced. The cabin's fragile threshold gave way with a thunderous crash. A figure stumbled inside, boots scraping against weary floorboards. The warrior met him with a roar, swinging his bow like a fierce tempest. Wood cracked against leather and bone. The infant's cries swelled, piercing the chaos with unyielding vulnerability. Within the cramped shadows, cold steel gleamed. The patrol advanced with ruthless precision, a deadly storm honed by years of unforgiving bloodshed. They flowed like a relentless tide, hearts chilled by orders and washed in vengeance. The warrior rolled beneath a sweeping blow, pain flaring sharp along his ribs, grit hardening his jaw. Rising again, he seized the fallen plank, smashing it into an assailant who howled in fierce defiance. But the enemy pressed closer, relentless heat against the cabin walls. A raspy, bitter laughter shattered the air, a sinister sound, cold as the grave's embrace. A voice snarled above the fray. "You believe this sanctuary will save you? Ghosts clinging to dust, soon to be swept away." The words sliced the night, dripping with ancient scars and vengeful fury. Recognition struck the warrior like thunder. Beyond the shattered door stood a figure cloaked in black, a specter from a past drenched in blood and betrayal. His eyes, ice-edged and unforgiving, locked onto the warrior with a weight that crushed hope. "No peace for the traitors," the figure hissed, voice an unforgiving blade. "You betrayed us all." The widow gasped, breath snagged in a choke of dread and defiance. "Why now, after all this agony?" Her trembling hands pulled the infants closer, a fragile shield forged of desperate love. The hunter's shadow stretched long, stepping forward with boots crunching over broken earth, then vanishing, only to reappear at the window, a silent specter weaving through the vulnerable refuge. "Some debts cannot be buried," he murmured, promise of fire and retribution veiled in his cold breath. The warrior's jaw clenched, eyes ablaze with fury and grief intertwined as dart storms. Every fiber urged flight, yet a sacred oath bound him, an indomitable vow to shield the widow and her helpless triplets from the ravenous storm. "I will stand, even if the world crumbles around me," he growled, voice rough and raw. Outside, hooves thundered, a relentless drumbeat, closing in, splintering the night with the scent of gunpowder, dread and unforgiving loss. The valley held its breath, a fragile hush before the inevitable tempest. A tear traced the widow's cheek, warm against the cold shadows. She lifted trembling hands to the fractured sky, a whispered prayer without words escaping cracked lips. "Then let us meet the dawn on our own terms, within the cabin's dark heart." A subtle shift, the surrender to an encroaching storm, wrapped in fierce defiance. Fragile lives now bound by threads of unyielding fate. And beyond the ridge, the hunter's cruel smile gleamed, a cold promise forged in fire and shadow. Tonight, the past would bleed into the present. Tomorrow, only ashes would remain. Yet, on this breath, held tight in darkness, the warrior's voice whispered, carrying the weight of stubborn resolve. "This is far from over." A ragged cough shattered the tense air. From the gloom, a new figure emerged, unknown and unreadable, cloaked not in black, but in the fading glow of a dying star. Eyes sharp with secrets, steps silent as shadows. Before the widow or warrior could respond, a sudden flare, a gunshot, crackled, tearing through the fragile calm. The figure doubled, collapsing into the dust-choked silence. And through the settling smoke, a single word fell like a dagger: betrayal. The night had deepened, folding the valley in shadows heavy as guilt. The cabin, a fragile heartbeat in the vast unforgiving wilderness, trembled under the weight of fate, pressing hard against its wooden walls. Inside, the widow's arms tightened, cradling her triplets as the echoes of gunfire faded into a tense, uneasy silence. The warrior's breath came steady, a slow pulse of steel and storm. His eyes, dark and sharp, pierced the gloom beyond the threshold, tracking the shadows where the enemy had receded. For now, the wounds throbbed cold beneath his leather, but the pain was a distant thing. His mind fought a fierce war between the instinct to protect and the desperate need to understand the new threat that had shattered their fragile refuge. The cabin lay battered. Splintered wood lay like broken promises across the floorboards, and the flickering candle cast trembling silhouettes that danced with anguish on the rough walls. The triplets, small sacks of fragile life, whimpered quietly between the pauses of the storm. Their tiny breaths, a fragile cadence against the roar of looming doom. The widow's eyes burned with a fierce light, equal parts fear and defiance. Her gaze never wavered from the jagged doorway, from which the chilling words had fallen like ice cream shards. Betrayal. A single syllable, heavy with venom, an accusation that unsettled the hard-won trust between protector and protected. The warrior lowered his bow slowly, muscles taut as steel cables, and studied the spot where the unknown figure had fallen. The gunshot's echo still lingered in his ears, a cruel punctuation to the night's chaos. That solitary word, whispered through dust and shadow, clawed at the edges of his mind. Who had betrayed whom? And why now, when the stakes were as sharp as the arrowheads at his back? His grip tightened around the rough plank he had torn from the broken door, fingers white with resolve. The oath he had sworn echoed like a drumbeat inside him, unbreakable, unyielding. Protection was no longer a choice. It was a fire burned into his very bones. Yet beneath the warrior's fierce exterior, a storm of uncertainty roiled. Shadows of past betrayals, ghosts he had fought long ago, threatening to swallow the fragile light of this stolen moment. The widow took a trembling breath and edged closer. Her voice, though fragile, carried a sudden steel beneath it. "We cannot hide forever." The warrior's gaze met hers, dark eyes like storm clouds rolling over dry hills. "They will come again," he said softly, and with more than rage. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of cold iron and distant hooves. The night whispered secrets the silence could no longer guard. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, the black-cloaked hunter paced like a shadow, tethered to vengeance, his breath a chill across the scorched earth. The warrior's scars ached anew. The reckoning was no longer a distant threat. It was a blade pressed against their throats. A soft whimper from the triplets cracked the heavy stillness. The widow turned, brushing damp strands from her forehead, and forced a tenuous calm into their fragile sanctuary. "We need a plan," she murmured, voice low but fierce. "Waiting will invite death to our door." His lips pressed into a hard line. The barren landscape offered little refuge, and the closest help lay days away across hostile terrain. To move would mean risking exposure. To stay meant courting annihilation. Every choice carried a poison, every path a silent trap. The warrior knelt beside her, voice gravel and ash. "I know these lands better than any, but this is something darker, something older. The blood that stains this valley runs deeper than we thought." Her heart tightened at his words, the weight of tribal conflict, grudges buried and now unearthed, pressed hard between them. She sensed the warrior's burden, his exile not only from his people, but from peace itself. In his presence, the frontier's harsh truths wore a face, one carved by loss and courage. A sudden flicker of movement caught his attention, a slender figure slipping at the cabin's edge, delicate but deliberate. The warrior rose sharply, instincts honed by years of relentless pursuit flaring bright. "Stay close," he warned. Eyes narrowing into the creeping night. "Alone," she said, voice steady despite the quake beneath. The warrior considered the woman's words, a new facet of the nightmare unfolding. His bow was already in hand, arrow nocked and shining fierce under the candle's flicker. "Then we fight," he said, cold fire searing in his eyes. "Not for vengeance, but for what remains to be saved." Outside, the wind turned colder, carrying with it the faint but unmistakable cadence of hooves, pounding nearer like the heartbeat of encroaching doom. The hunter's shadow loomed still along the ridge, silence heavy between each slow step, bearing witness to the quiet promise etched in the valley's dust. Nothing could stay buried forever. The warrior's grip tightened, drawing the bowstring back one last time, and beneath the darkened sky, a voice shattered the night, low and dangerous as thunder breaking. "You have one night to answer for every ghost you left behind." The arrow's hum split the air. The valley held its breath. The reckoning had come. The splintered fragments of the cabin door hung suspended in the air, like shattered memories, caught mid-fall. The warrior's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the rage that seethed beneath his skin, coiling tight as steel. The infant's cries pierced the stifling stillness, a raw, desperate counterpoint to the heavy toll of pounding hooves beyond the darkened threshold. He braced his battered frame against the fractured wood, breath steady despite the crackling chaos. Each thud from the other side vibrated through his bones, a relentless drum of approaching doom. Yet in the widow's trembling arms, the fragile sparks of life held strong, a fragile talisman against the storm encroaching on their fragile refuge. A shadow surged through the gap. The warrior's muscles coiled, bow swept upward with deadly grace. The arrow sang its cold song, slicing through the hushed chaos. A muted grunt, agonized and abrupt, rent the night. Silence clawed at the edge of the cabin, brief and breathless before the assault reignited. The widow leaned low, pressing her bruised cheek against the rough wall. Her whispered prayers traded places with the wails of her children, each tear a currency of survival. She caught the warrior's glance, a tempest of anguish and unyielding will, a silent pact forged in urgency, protect no matter the cost, Footsteps thundered, battering and unrelenting. The cabin's bones trembled as jagged splinters spat out like arrows under the onslaught. With a guttural roar, the warrior swung his bow again, meeting brute force with raw fury. Men crashed forward, the rancid stench of sweat and hatred filling every inch of the confined space. In the flickering candlelight, faces warped by relentless hate pressed closer, eyes glazed with the promise of merciless judgment. The warrior gritted his teeth, feeling the sting of a blade graze his arm, a searing scream buried beneath clenched jaws. He countered with a savage swing of a broken plank, shattering ribs and resolve. The dance of survival spiraled, brutal and unforgiving, around the fragile cradle of innocence in the center. Then, as the storm reached its crescendo, an eerie laughter slithered through the chaos. Thin and slicing, a jagged blade against the symphony of despair. A voice, cold and sharpened by time, cut through the noise. "You cling to ghosts, fools. This land will cleanse itself of your kind." The warrior froze, heart pounding like thunder against impossibly fragile ribs. Emerging from the shadows stood the hunter, cloaked in black, a living specter of betrayal. His eyes, ice-piercing and unyielding, zeroed in with a weight that siphoned the air from the room. "Years passed. You abandoned us all." The hunter spat venom, voice slicing through the thickening smoke. "There is no forgiveness here." The widow met the hunter's gaze, raw fear and fierce defiance blazing in her aching eyes. Why now, after all the blood spilled? Her hands tightened around the infants, fragile shields against a bitter history. The hunter's silhouette stretched long, stepping out onto the broken earth, vanishing only to reappear at the fragmented window. Shadows clung to him like a mantle, silent witness to the merciless reckoning he'd come to deliver. Because old debts wake with the dying wind, and this valley remembers every stain. The warrior's jaw clenched, muscles taut, with a storm raging just beneath calm. Every fiber screamed to run, a desperate call echoed from years of exile and loss. But the oath, the sacred vow, held fast. "I will stand," he growled, voice raw with unwavering fire. "Even if we burn piece by piece." Outside, hooves thudded like the heartbeat of an approaching tempest. Closer now, a molten tide, hungry to swallow the fragile thread of hope left in these barren lands. The widow held back tears, a single molten river tracing down her dust-streaked cheek. She lifted weary hands toward fractured sky, a silent prayer wrapped in unyielding grit. "Then we meet this fight on our own terms." Within the shattered cabin, the air thickened, defiant breaths tethered to fragile lives, bound inexorably to the draft of destiny's cruel hand. The hunter's merciless smile gleamed beyond the ridge, a cold promise burning with finality. Tonight, the wounds of ancient grudges would bleed anew. Tomorrow, only the ashes of lost kin would linger. But in the fading shadow, as the warrior drew back his bowstring, voice barely a whisper, yet burning fierce beneath the quiet, "This is far from over." Then came the rasp, a cough, fractured and raw, slicing through the charged air. From the dusk stepped a new figure, neither friend nor foe. Robes tinted, not with night's black, but the faint dying glow of a forgotten star. Eyes sharp, unreadable, holding secrets too heavy for silence. Before the warrior or widow could breathe or move, a star flare cracked the night. Gunfire burning through the fragile calm. The stranger collapsed, body crumpling into dust and shadow. Amid the settling echoes, a single word fell, thick with betrayal and finality. Betrayal. The arrow's sharp cry faded into the night, swallowed by the howling wind as it pierced the shadowed doorway. The first man crumpled, a ragged groan escaping his lips before he hit the broken floorboards with a heavy thud. But the assault showed no mercy. More dark shapes surged forward, hunger and hatred etched deep into every grimace and breath. The warrior's stance was unyielding, his bow drawn and ready, eyes darting like lightning across the claustrophobic cabin. Each breath was a slow ignition of ice and fire, muscles coiled to strike, heart pounding with the promise of desperate survival. Behind him, the widow pressed, closer to the trembling forms of her triplets, her hands trembling not from weakness, but fragile, fierce protection. The fragile candlelight flickered wildly, shadows dancing like specters on the battered walls. The cabin groaned and shook under the relentless pounding of boots and fists, savage tides battering the fragile sanctuary. Wood splintered, glass cracked, and every cry from the infants stitched a ragged thread of urgency through the storm of violence. The warrior's jaw clenched tight, the weight of his oath anchoring fire to steady hands. "Their leader comes," he growled low, voice rough with earth and pain. "We must hold or fall with the wind." His eyes met the widow's, alive with fierce defiance beneath the weight of exhaustion and unspoken dread. Suddenly a sharp scraping sound drew every breath silent. The shattered door shuddered violently again, before splintering to reveal a cold figure stepping through, cloaked in black, moving with the calculated calm of death itself. The hunter's gaze was a blade sheathed in ice, eyes freezing the air, locking onto the warrior with a centuries-old accusation burned into their depths. "You think this refuge will protect you?" The hunter's voice slithered through the cabin, cutting like a whispered curse. "You abandoned your blood, left us to bleed in silence. Now you hide behind walls that will not save you." The widow's breath caught, heart hammering against ribs like a wild drum. "Why now?" she demanded, voice cracking but laced with fragile steel. "After all the years of ghosts and silence, why come back to tear this place apart?" The hunter stepped forward, boots crunching on shattered earth, the cold fire of vengeance blazing in each measured step. Because debts rot only deeper when left unpaid. This land remembers every betrayal, and we come to collect. The warrior tightened his grip on the bow, veins pulsing beneath sun-scorched skin. His voice was steel wrapped in gravel. "Then know this, no shadow will break my vow. Not while breath still stirs in me. They're under this roof, protected by steel, blood, and the unbroken promise between us." Outside, the pounding of hooves grew closer, thunder blows pressing in on every side. The valley seemed to hold its breath, a fragile pause under a sky of flickering stars. Somewhere, distant but close enough to taste, The returning patrol sharpened their hunt, the noose constricting, inescapable. A soft, ragged whimper rose from the triplets. The widow gathered them tighter, despite the cold seeping into her bones. Her eyes, glazed with tears and fire, met the warrior's steady gaze, a silent pact forged in the crucible of knowing that surrender was no longer an option. The hunter laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed off blackened earth. We have ears in the shadows, hands in the dust. Tonight, the past breaks free, and you stand naked before it. Suddenly, the air shifted. A flicker caught the edge of the widow's vision, a silhouette against the gloom, slender and tentative. The warrior's eyes narrowed, muscles trembling with barely restrained fury and caution. From the darkness, a young woman emerged, her face pale as moonlight, eyes wide pools of both dread and fierce resolve. Her fingers clutched a tattered cloth, stained with the desperation of flight. "I escaped," she whispered, voice brittle but clear. "They took the others, beyond the pass. When you shot," her words trailed into the cold night like a broken promise. The warrior's jaw tightened, realization sharpening terror in his chest. This was no mere raid. It was a purge, a surgical strike aiming to erase any trace of defiance. The war was wider now, bleeding beyond borders. A tense silence wrapped the cabin as the widow's voice rose, steady, defiant. "We are not alone. We will fight to the last breath if we must." The warrior nodded slowly, drawing a fresh arrow with a calm born from the edge of despair. "Not for revenge," he said, voice low and searing. "For survival, for the lives still clinging to hope." Outside, cruel winds carried the distant echo of return. Hooves pounding, shadows nearing, the relentless, inexorable drum of doom. The hunter lingered atop the ridge, features carved in moonlight and menace, a silent judge waiting to deliver final sentence. The warrior let his bowstring hum taut, arrow poised to fly. A sudden crack, a gunshot fractured the night's brittle calm, sharp and searing. The young woman gasped and stumbled forward, collapsing into dust and silence. Before the widow or warrior could react, a single word slipped through the haze, a whisper soaked in bitter frost: betrayal. The warrior's arrow had barely settled into the night air when the first cries shattered the tense quiet of the cabin. The door trembled under the relentless hammer of iron fists and beaten wood, fragments raining inside, as if the very walls were bleeding broken promises. The widow tightened her grip on the triplets, their soft cries muffled against her breast, trembling breaths woven with the brittle threads of fear and fierce resolve. The warrior's frame pressed against the cracked doorframe, veins taut beneath sun-baked skin. His eyes blazed with a tempest of fury and exhaustion, every muscle coiled like a spring ready to snap. The scent of gunpowder and wild desperation thickened the air, pressing heavy against the seams of their fragile refuge. Outside, the pounding hooves drew nearer, a relentless drumbeat of doom. But it was the whisper of boots in broken glass that cut deeper. The hunter, cloaked in shadows like death's own emissary, gliding across the fractured threshold that had once promised safety. No walls will storm. We did what we must to survive. What you call betrayal was survival. A cruel smirk twisted the hunter's lips. Survival? You betrayed your own, he spat. His cold eyes burned with an unforgiving fire as he stepped further inside, boots echoing like the final toll of a death knell. The warrior's bow was drawn once more, arrow poised with deadly intent. His voice, raw and unyielding, cut through the thick tension. You want blood? You'll have it. But this night ends with us standing, not bowed. The air thickened, breaths hitching with the weight of countless unsaid fears. For a brief moment, time stilled. The valley's breath held tight between the sorrow of what was lost and the unforgiving dawn yet to come. Suddenly, a cold gust slammed through the shattered window, carrying with it a figure bathed in pale moonlight. The silhouette was neither friend nor foe, but a bearer of fragile hope and darker secrets. She stepped in silently, eyes wide, yet glowing with unspoken truths. I escaped, she whispered, voice trembling but resolute. They took the others. Beyond the pass, the tribes are hunted. You must know, the war comes closer than ever. The warrior's teeth clenched, knuckles white on the bow. This was no longer a simple chase or a vendetta. It was a cleansing, a brutal purge waged to erase every spark of resistance from these lands. The widow's fingers curled tighter, a shield cast purely, of desperate love. Then we do not wait to be swallowed. We fight, for them, for us, for the stories that refuse to die. A sudden crack rippled through the cabin. The young woman's foot stumbled on a loose board, sending a cascade of splinters skittering underfoot. Time snapped back. Eyes locked, hearts thundered. Outside hooves echoed louder. A rising tide of steel and shadow, closing the noose. The hunter's figure melted back into darkness, his voice a venomous promise on the wind. You have one night to answer, for every ghost you left bleeding in this valley. The warrior's breath caught, then exhaled a low growl that carried the weight of storms. His arrow sang as he released the bowstring. A whisper, sharp as a fallen star. In the shivering shadows, the fragile hope of survival coiled tight. Their fight was far from over. And beneath the heavy sky, where ancient grudges breathed fire into the night, a single, shattering truth shattered the silence. The betrayal was still bleeding in the dark. The dawn crept over the barren valley, pale light pooling softly on the battered cabin's shattered beams. The night's fury had spent itself, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed woven from the very bones of the earth. Inside, the widow's arms still cradled the triplets, their fragile breaths steady now, as if buoyed by the fragile promise of morning's grace. The warrior sat nearby, wounds aching but spirit unbowed, eyes heavy with the toll of fight and loss. The stranger's collapse the night before lingered like a shadow upon their hearts, a ghost of betrayal whose meaning now unfolded with searing clarity. Trust, once strong but tested, had fractured. Yet here, amid the wreckage, a new understanding took root. The venomous word betrayal no longer signaled an end, but the painful birth of truth forced into the light. The warrior's gaze met the widow's with quiet steel. "He was sent to break us from within," he murmured. His voice carried the weight of battle-worn years, a solemn confession to the woman who had stood fiercely beside him through fire and blood. "But we are not crushed, not yet." Her lips pressed, thin, eyes steady. "There is no room now for doubt," she said softly. "We protect what remains, not just our lives, but the stories of those who came before us, the memory of those lost, the hope for those yet to come." Her fingers brushed the downy heads of her children. "We must stand, or all falls to dust." Outside, the faint clatter of hooves approached slowly, but this time with no menace, only the cautious steps of those who sought parley rather than slaughter. Through the cracked door came a single figure, flag of truce raised, face shadowed, but hands open in peace. The warrior rose, bow still in hand, but lowered. "Speak," he commanded, voice steady but wary. From the shadows, the figure answered, "We come bearing words from the tribes beyond the pass. The purge was not ordered by all. Some seek ceasefire, to end the cycle of bloodshed." The widow's breath caught, a fragile thread of hope she hadn't allowed herself until now. "Why now?" she asked, voice trembling with cautious longing. "Because even old wounds can heal," the messenger replied, "but only if trust is rebuilt. A new path can be forged, if those willing dare walk it together." The warrior studied the messenger's eyes, hard, wary, burdened but sincere. Slowly he nodded. "We have fought with shadows long enough." He stepped outside, hand extended to the messengers. The first grasp of peace since the valley had become a battleground. Behind him, the widow pulled the triplets close, a soft smile breaking through the wariness. The stars faded into a pale morning, light stirring the dust on scorched earth. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the hunter's shadow receded, swallowed by dawn's merciful embrace. The reckoning would come no more, not here, not now. In that quiet hour, the warrior lowered his bow fully for the first time in weeks. A warrior not driven solely by rage, but by a newfound purpose to protect and rebuild. The wife, the mother, carried her children into the sunlight, a symbol of fragile lives enduring against the harsh winds of history and hate. The valley held its breath no longer. It sighed, a deep exhale, as if finally finding relief after years of storm. And though scars ran deep, a new story began to write itself in the dust and sky. A story of forgiveness found where least expected, of bridges built with trembling hands after the bitterest fall. The warrior spoke softly, words no longer cloaked in battle cries, but in quiet resolve. "This valley remembers, so shall we. The pain, the loss, and the courage to face what comes next." The widow nodded, tears gleaming in the pale light. "For them," she whispered, "and for all who will follow." Together, they turned toward the horizon, where the sun burned away the night's shadows, their journey ending here, in the fragile dawn of peace, born from fire, sacrifice, and unyielding hope.